Welcome back to our seventh lecture over theater history. So we begin today with a very speculative sort of beginning of theater history. We can sort of trace it back to these cultural or spiritual exhibitions, these rites of passage such as circumcision, these very universal things like people sticking animal heads on their top of their head and then acting out and pretending that they're an animal. These are, ancient and, not what we might call a play with a beginning, middle, and an end, but they definitely have merit as a theatrical experience. If we are dancing around a fire, whether we're Native Americans or Africans or Egyptians, and we're sort of telling these stories about the hunt, then we can sort of kind of take from that a sense of theatricality. Of course, the animal sacrifice, the rituals of sacrificing an animal would have also been very theatrical in nature. And I think it's interesting that he kind of talks about magic and religion and sort of the theatrical nature of those. And I've heard it described several different ways, but my favorite definition is that magic is trying to get the gods to do what you want them to do, and religion is complying with what the gods have already told you. So, there are some elements there of trickery in magic, and then also in religion, the set down performance rituals, such as, you know, taking communion, like I do every Sunday with the wine and the bread. That would be a ritual and very theatrical in nature. So, animism. Here, once again, I have the Celts, the Gaelic tradition here. They're standing around a tree, assuming that the tree has a sense of magical power, has a sense of God in it, right? And so when people, the shamans, would dress up like an animal or assume a trance-like state, and supposedly the gods would speak through them when they were in that trance. And like I said, this happened in the Celtic tradition, this happened in the Native American and the African, still happens today in the Haitian sort of tradition of voodoo. So there's a lot of continuity between these theatrical exhibitions in different religious ceremonies. So we can kind of think of that as the beginnings of traditional drama. And he also talks a little bit about sub-Saharan Africa and these beautiful masks that they wear and the way that they act out the hunt, which was particularly interesting there. And then he goes on page 199 to discuss Horace and Osiris, the battle that we had with Set. And Set was the underworld. He was the god of chaos. And so most people would have been voting for Horus or Osiris, depending on what level he was in then. And then there would have been an acting it out on the river, which is with some dancing and some dialogue, and of course acting out the violence there. I particularly thought it was interesting that maces represented Set's testicles. I thought that was an odd line to throw in there. But this would have been a Egyptian springtime ritual that was acted on the river. Otherwise, we know very little about Egyptian drama in general, besides this one festival where that epic battle was acted out. So the big passion play on the river is one we know that happened in ancient Egypt. And now we come back to over and over again, ancient Greece, the golden age of the classics, 500 BC, and our theatron, right? The remember from chapter 1, the seeing place where people would come to see the theater. It's important to know why they came to the theater. It was definitely for a sense of catharsis. You have to remember that all of these men had gone through war together. And so to relive these stories, to relive this pain, was part of their way of releasing all of the emotion and moving on with their lives. So it would have been a very powerful time of emotion. The Greek chorus, you can see a picture on page 200 of the Greek chorus members from Euripides there. But the Greek chorus would have been a group of, 20 men or so singing and chanting all together. And as far as plot, they would talk to the main character, they would advise him and be a confidant, and eventually we would have two main characters on stage plus the chorus. There was a time when Thespis was the only one apart from the chorus, but in the staging of it, that kind of helps you imagine what it was like. Even before Thespis stepped out of the chorus, they would have been walking in a circle and chanting, very much like we would think of an African ritual now with drums and rhythmic speaking. There were these little comic plays after these deep, tragic, painful, epic stories like Medea and Oedipus that we know about. And these satyr plays were lighthearted. They would elevate the mood. These satyrs were believed to have been mischievous little guys with horns that would run around naked and lighten the mood for those. And that would have been written by the exact same writer of the tragic plays as well. To understand Greek theater, you really have to understand who Dionysus is. He is the god that we would worship, the demigod. He was the god of sex. So there was a lot of orgies going on in the audience, from what we understand, particularly when it came to the Roman times. Now, when we came into the Roman times, Dionysus was changed. His name was changed to Bacchus. But we know that Tertullian, who was a Christian father living in Rome, he saw the theater as a completely evil place, partially because sex was going on in the theater where the play was being performed. Now, whether that was homosexual sex or with the temple prostitutes, we're not really sure, but we do know that it was considered a vile place by the Christians. I mean, other than the fact that it was just used as temple worship to Dionysus. So it would have been a place of orgies, a sense of phallus worship. It would have been in the spring, celebrating rebirth or resurrection. There's maybe said to have been some sacrifice of animals or of people, but that's very speculative as well. So, in order to understand the atmosphere of a Greek play, you really have to understand Dionysus, which they talk even more about on the video that you recently watched. So, hopefully, you've got a good sense of who that was. So as I said, the Roman theater was a little bit different. You can see multiple entrances there, a more grand facade, eventually moving to a more Colosseum atmosphere, which I thought was interesting. Your book talks about on page 203, sort of how soon it would digress into sort of these gruesome public massacres. One thing that changed is we got vomitoriums, which were underground places where people could go and throw up their food, which was because on these days of feasting, they believed that this binging and purging was a form of catharsis, that they could eat a lot and then throw it back up, and then they'd be ready to eat again. And that was part of the inner cleansing that was happening through these stories. So... Okay, so now we've moved a couple hundred years here into the Christian drama phase. Like I said, Tertullian really believed that the evil in the theater could infect your eyes. It could come, the evil that you see could come in through your eyes. And Tertullian, as far as church fathers go, was very into asceticism. He didn't believe in masturbation. He did not believe in the sex commingling, and as part of that, he didn't believe in the theater and its orgy sort of sensibility. So, but that's really stuck with us throughout Christendom. When we got into Shakespeare's day, those people still couldn't get Christian burials because Tertullian had ordained the theater to be an evil place. So, oddly enough, though, in their desperation, many of the higher-ups of the medieval church decided to start doing theater within the church and kind of decided to reclaim it because they had so many illiterate people. You have to remember the priests were speaking in Latin, and the people didn't read or write. They were just trying to not catch the plague. So you can see the use of the stained glass window was very instrumental in this time because people could look at the pictures, which told a story. But when they came to Mass, they didn't understand what was going on. So it was up to the priests to really get to the people in the streets and help them to understand the stories of the Bible through other means than reading it. And also, it was illegal for them to have their own version of the Bible in their own language, right? We know that didn't happen until the Renaissance. So this was a common staging device, which they also talked about in your book, which was not in your book, in the video you just watched. The pageant wagon was a place where they would perform up high so that the people around at the bottom, everybody could see. Now they would move that pageant wagon along for different scenes. So it was more like a parade than a play, which is interesting because parades were never banned by the church, even though parades were typically a pagan ritual. They had begun as a ritual to the sun god in Rome before Rome was Christianized. And so that just kind of tells you how the church sort of picked and chose which rituals to keep and which ones to throw out. But since it had this sort of sense of the parade still being part of the Christian tradition, that was sort of the side of things that lasted. And parades are still very important in the Catholic Church. If you go down to New Orleans, right, for Mardi Gras, that's traditionally a religious celebration. And that parade is in the tradition of the Catholic parade. So just some things to think about as you're analyzing how these are still alive and well today. It would not be unusual for groups or guilds to get together and create plays based on kind of what their expertise was. So here we have a ship that would have been maybe Noah's Ark and put on by the shipbuilders, or we have this Hell's Mouth might have been put on by the blacksmiths because they understand and know how to work with fire. But the point here is that many of them were volunteers. We have reason to believe that some jugglers and gymnasts and musician, performer, actor types were paid by royal courts and such, but for the most part these religious plays were much more popular, and hardly anyone was getting paid to be a theater artist, as it was condemned by the church as a vocation. These mansions and mystery plays, jesting and comic interplay were a big part of the medieval theater. All right, so we're moving right along at a breakneck speed because you've already heard a lot of this in your other video that you watched. Commedia dell'arte is the professional actors of the Italian theater. It was very crass, right? And this, another thing that they did mention in the other movie that I thought is particularly interesting is that the Commedia dell'arte had women on stage, and at the same time that England still forbade women from being on the stage in Shakespeare's plays. That's me at the Globe Theater. Had a great time being inside. This is a recreated Globe Theater. The real Globe Theater burned down many, many times. You can see the inside of it. It is all cedar, and it had a thatched roof, which is the traditional Celtic architecture, that circle with a thatched roof. So they created this recreation of the globe based on what they understood. You can see that exit sign down in the bottom there. But the Shakespeare's golden age of theater is something you have heard me talk about in several other lectures, so just make sure that you've watched the other video in the book, and hopefully you're caught up on both Commedia and the Renaissance. Alright, so the last Western part of our history lesson today is the Royal Theater. So after the Renaissance, we have the theater shutting down for 18 years of puritanical rule here. And of course, under the Puritans, there was no theater whatsoever because the Puritans were very interested in maintaining Christendom. And the theater, like I said, was already kind of on the edge. So When we get to the Romantic theater, this is after the Puritan age is over and we have the restoration of the monarchy. In fact, often instead of the Romantic, you might hear them say the Restoration theater. Many of these poets in England were very over the top. They were witty, they were funny, the style was very sexual and very audacious, just as you can see the fashion was. These big, huge wigs, these big moles on people's faces. It was very farcical and over the top, and very lighthearted and comical. And that was partially as a reaction to this sense of austere, you know, contemplation of the Puritan time. It was a reaction against that. If you look at Moliere, he had his rhyming couplets, he had Tartuffe, he had a lot of fun, if we want to be honest. And Moliere was in France, of course. And Racine, also in France, had a neoclassical time. He did a recreation of ancient Grecian plays that were very famous. Goethe is one of my favorites over in Germany. He is known for his heartfelt creation of these poetic characters. And so Romanticism really was melodramatic, it was sentiment, it was engaging, and it was very different than the naturalism, which we'll get into talking about when we discuss modernity next class. But you can see how this sort of extreme Louis XIV sort of aesthetic would be a good contrast to what comes next in realism and simplicity and the common man. All right, so that was our breakneck speed of the Western theater, and hopefully you watched that very British video of that was very concise in telling you the Western history. But I'm going to take just a little time to cover the Eastern history. Now, I asked you to watch the clips on each one of those Eastern traditions, and I realized that some of those clips are embedded in conversations about architecture or a famous historical figure, but it is good that at least we found clips where you could see sort of a snippet of each type of Western theater. So if you would bear with me through those sections that aren't necessarily pertinent to the class as it gets into just seeing a snippet of the style of theater. It's so much easier for you to see it than me spend a whole lot of time describing it. So we're going to talk about 4 basic Eastern types of theater, and it is sort of hard to make these broad sweeping gestures of the entirety of Eastern theater, but it is fair to say that in some ways it's very different from Western theater in general. Once again, these are generalizations, but they're fairly true. If you sit down to watch an Eastern play, there's going to be much less talking. It's much more of a dance, a mime act, set to music almost always, and it's always much more visually arresting than a Western play, and for the most part. Most Western plays are more people sitting around talking. Most Eastern plays are more dance-oriented and more aesthetically pleasing just to look at. So whereas the Western shows are usually trying to get you to think about a certain idea, you know, especially someone like Brecht, they're trying to get you to contemplate these really high-minded philosophies. Eastern theater is much more just trying to help you enjoy a visual representation of something, much less intellectual. So in the West, we try to just mimic what's happening in real life. You know, Shakespeare famously said, you know, as in a mirror is what kind of we try to create in the theater. But in the East, they're not trying to mimic the real world, they're trying to mimic the mystic or mythical world. Often in the East, they're depicting a god or goddess as they went through their life. So they're using larger-than-life makeup, larger-than-life costumes to sort of depict these epic battles between royalty or the gods. The Eastern theater is much less plot-driven, right? In the West, we're waiting for the next event to happen. Boy kisses girl, or boy stabs other soldier. You know, we're looking for these plot points. But the Eastern theater is not always representative of beginning, middle, and end. In Eastern theater, we're often enjoying an experience, right? And the experience can go off on tangents and take its time. It's not necessarily, you know, one event after another. Once again, these are generalizations. And then, of course, in the East, most of these children have either been adopted at a very early age, and sometimes, because they have no family, they've been adopted into these theater training facilities, or the parents sort of bring them in to be trained. And often it was a family business. If you were an actor, then your children would be actors through this sort of trade sensibility. Whereas most Western theater was a career choice once a person came into age. So the first we're going to talk about in the Eastern tradition is Kotta Kali, and this is a Hindu tradition, and you can see that it is the depiction of the gods and the royal characters, that he has the crown there, that it is an intense training. There's gongs and cymbals and drums. I thought that the eyebrow movements were absolutely fascinating, and I would love to know more about how that fits into the scheme of things. We do know that it is a ritual that starts at late at night, at 10 o'clock at night, and then ends after breakfast the next morning. So it is traditionally a really long performance, and one that it's not rude to eat or sleep through at points. It is specifically a Hindu ritual, and I think that's all I have to say about the Kotta Kali. I've never seen a Kotta Kali, and I would be interested too. I think it is considered a sacred depiction, which is maybe why we didn't see a real visual representation of it. If you ever come across a YouTube video or anything of some Kotta Kali, by all means, please forward it on to me. I would be happy to investigate it even more. It looks like an absolutely beautiful and fascinating tradition. I know I love Bali dancing. If it's anything like that, I would be spellbound. So the next one I know a little bit more about, which is the Beijing Opera. The Beijing Opera is very musical and beautiful. You can see the ornate headdresses and makeup that's pretty traditional in the Eastern theater. It was established for the monarchy, as was a lot of theater in both East and West, right? And we say it was established then, but we're telling stories from hundreds and hundreds of years earlier, so there's really no exact way to know when it started. Most of the themes were around honoring ancestors, and so it was less emphasis on who the writer was. In fact, when we go back to look at the Chinese opera, we don't have any idea who the writers are. And also, once again, just like the Indian theater, it was not unusual for it to be held in a banquet hall where everybody is eating and laughing and talking at the same time that the Beijing opera is being presented. Now, they might get quiet for a second when the combat scene comes, or when she commits suicide on stage. When the interesting parts happen, they may quiet down. But in general, back when it began in a banquet hall. Now, once again, that's a big generalization. When I recently watched a movie about the Beijing Opera, it was all in a by the time it got into this last century, everyone was sitting and facing and watching respectfully the stage. So once again, that's a generalization. There are two basic styles. I would try to pronounce them, but I would make a fool of myself. So we'll just say they're both domestic and military. Two general styles are domestic and military. I also should mention that Peking is the same thing as Beijing, just two different. Peking is what we used to say. Beijing is the most accurate now. So it's fascinating to see how stylized these movements are. I found a YouTube video just entirely of hand gestures. It was amazing to see. And when I watched that movie, The Last Emperor, it was all about, somebody would walk up to the actor and say, I noticed you took 3 steps instead of 2 steps. So it's all highly ritualistic. It's all highly traditional. And it's just a matter of learning what the last person did. Whereas if, I came on and did the same exact Lady Macbeth as someone else in the Western culture, that would be considered plagiarism. So there are different standards there and different things prioritized. Once again, training begins as a child. There is no lighting equipment, no backdrops usually. It's primarily what's on the actor's body is what comes with them. You can see the wigs, the makeup. And I heard it explained this way when I was in China. It's as if Pavarotti were asked to stand on a chair, do a backflip off of it, land in the splits, and then hit his note. And so it's just a completely different set of skills in the Beijing Opera. You're not just asked to sing, you have to be able to do it all. And with a lot of traditional stories here, we do have men portraying women as they would have in Shakespeare's days. And you'll notice in that video that I asked you to watch about Kabuki theater, they mentioned this, that some of the men who portrayed women then became transgender or cross-gender, and it was not unusual for them to participate in prostitution. And that is not exclusive to the Chinese or the Japanese tradition. We have records of that happening in Shakespearean's time, in the ancient Grecian time. It's once again that imagination. Once men start to kind of think of themselves as a woman, but then at the same time, how much of that was picking the men who were already effeminate in nature? I don't want to speculate too much about that, because just because someone is effeminate doesn't necessarily mean they're homosexual. And at that time, I know that for some of the actors, that male prostitution was because they were so underpaid. So anyway, all of that is just sort of a disclaimer to say that men played women and identified deeply, and it was sort of interesting when women were able to come back to the Chinese stage. They're actually teaching the women how to walk like women. This is deeply offensive to us women, because at the time women in China would bind their feet, so they would walk differently than men because their feet were bound, and it was sort of a rare form of torture. If you've never looked up foot binding, that's a tangent we could go off on. But regardless, all of this to say, switching genders in the theater happens often and has ramifications sometimes on people's daily lives. All right, so your book sort of touches on this on page 215. But Mao, when he came into power, he sort of used the Beijing Opera as his propaganda machine. He used it to empower the proletariat. Now, if you can see the themes that we had before in the Chinese opera, a lot of them were submission to authority, a lot of them were reverence and humility and accepting your place in life. But of course, once the communism took hold, they sort of either rewrote these stories or brought out the stories that were more about the everyday working man, the proletariat, and honoring him. And so only 8 model plays were allowed to be performed. There was extreme censorship during this time. And it is important to know that Mao made a lot of mistakes, and he brought about a agricultural change that caused mass starvation in China, unfortunately. So he wasn't necessarily the most popular guy when he first started off. Now, by the end, he was very revered. But there was a sense of melodrama, and some people started to resent the Chinese opera because of the way that Mao used it. And when it came back, once the Chinese communism opened up more to capitalism, a lot of the same traditions had died. For example, in the Chinese tradition, the former actor would teach the younger actor how to portray that role. Well, when half of their plays were banned by the government, those people died off, and so the play died off with them, because it was an art form passed down generation to generation. So the Chinese opera has been revitalized. The government has put a lot of money in to try to rebuild it, but it suffered greatly through the use of propaganda. All right, so moving past the Beijing Opera into the Japanese Noh Theater. Now, the Noh Theater is a Buddhist theater. It's done by Buddhist monks in the reclusive agricultural areas. It's still performed in Japan. You can see the way that it's performed through that little short video we heard here. It's very quiet, it's very contemplative. You can see the drummers in the background there. Once again, highly ritualistic. You take 6 steps to the left and 7 steps to the right, and it's passed down generation to generation. They would wear masks and change the masks for different characters that they would play. Precise choreography is utilized. There is an entire traditional setup, so that there's a long bridge that they walk up, and they take these little short looking steps. It's accompanied by a flute, and it still goes on in Japan today if you want to see some Noh theater. It's highly in contrast to what a lot of us think about commercial Japan. So I like that the video I was able to show you kind of showed the contrast between this traditional Noh theater and popular culture in Japan. Yeah. So it is performed by the priests. It often is the story of the gods and coming down to earth, and our Buddha visiting the earth through people. And so it is very long and drawn out. If you read a script from the Japanese Noh, it's only a few lines because there's so much dancing and moving between it, but it's very solemn, very still, very slow movements. But it's very traditional. It's been done the same way for thousands and thousands of years. On the back, we see that tree that's always there. I like the way they describe it in your book as glacial, just very, very slow. And Tadashi Suzuki, which is a method that I studied when I was in grad school, really talks about the power of stillness and how the monks would study this partially as just a disciplining their mind to be still. They would also do this ritualistic stamping, trying to grab the attention of the gods, and very similar to sort of if you've ever studied the samurai methods of training, very much similar. So now for something completely different, Kabuki theater. Kabuki is similar to our musical theater. It has outlandish plots. There's usually a fox that shows up somewhere. There's trapdoors and big acrobatic displays, song and dance, and it did start in around the 1600s, the same time as the Renaissance in England. It was traditionally performed by women first, and puppets, and women were banned from the stage for being suspected of prostitution, which they talked about a little bit in the video that you watched. So there is a big emphasis on suicide in Kabuki that's very controversial, because people would go away and then commit suicide themselves or commit suicide on stage, and so that's just something to be aware of when it comes to the Kabuki theater. Stories were rituals that people had seen before, but often the authorship is unknown. So the Noh theater, just as we're talking contrast, the Noh is glacial and quiet and reverent and thoughtful, and the Kabuki is loud and cymbals and fun and acrobatics, often with very serious themes though, including suicides. So that is my very quick breakdown of the history in both the East and the West. I hope that those video supplements help you to understand it a little more deeply, and thank you for listening.